Welcome back to Decoding Causality, Season 1. We're taking a look at Chapter 5 of The Book of Why by Judea Pearl and Dana McKenzie.
Oh, this is a good one.
Yeah, this chapter is called The Smoke-Filled Debate, Clearing the Air.
Mm.
You know, it might sound kind of odd at first, but it's a really interesting look back at a time when something we totally take for granted today, that smoking causes lung cancer, was like the hot topic in the scientific world.
Right. It's wild to think about now. This podcast and summary were prepared by Amir Rafai. This debate was raging back in the 1950s and 60s.
Wow, so long ago.
Yeah, long before we had the tools and the understanding of causality that we have now.
I can imagine it must have been way harder to prove that link back then, especially since you can't exactly do a randomized controlled trial for something like smoking.
Oh, absolutely. You can't just tell a bunch of people, all right, you guys smoke for the next few decades and we'll see what happens.
Not exactly ethical, is it? So what were some of the biggest challenges researchers faced back then?
Well, one of the main things was that there wasn't a clear framework for understanding and proving causality.
I see.
Back then, the focus was really on statistics and observing correlations.
Right. Just because two things happen together doesn't automatically mean one causes the other. Like, I remember learning that correlation doesn't equal causation in like my first stats class.
Exactly. And that's precisely what a lot of the skeptics were saying about the smoking lung cancer link.
Oh, so even back then there were people who didn't believe it.
Oh, yeah. One of the most famous skeptics was a statistician named R.A. Fisher.
Oh, wow. A big name in statistics.
He was a huge deal. He actually suggested there might be some hidden factor, like maybe a smoking gene, that could explain why smokers got lung cancer more often.
Oh, interesting. So are they saying people with this gene are just predisposed to both smoking and lung cancer, making it look like smoking is the cause when it's really the gene?
Exactly. It's a classic example of what we call confounding, where a third variable, like that hypothetical gene, is messing with the relationship between the two things we're actually interested in. This is why just looking at correlations can be so misleading.
That makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
So how did researchers try to prove the smoking lung cancer link if they couldn't do a randomized controlled trial?
They had to get creative.
I bet.
Two of the pioneers in this area were Richard Dahl and Austin Bradford Hill. They were among the first to use something called a case control study.
Okay, and what's that?
Imagine you interview hundreds of lung cancer patients and find out that almost all of them were smokers. The odds of that happening just by chance are like ridiculously small.
Yeah, that does seem pretty convincing.
Yeah.
But I imagine those case control studies have some drawbacks too, right?
Oh, for sure. They rely on people's memories. And our memories can be, shall we say, a little fuzzy sometimes, especially when you're trying to remember things that happened years ago.
Totally. So how did they overcome that issue?
Well, that's why Dahl and Hill didn't stop there. In 1951, they started this groundbreaking perspective study. Instead of looking back in time, they followed a huge group of British doctors for years and years.
Oh, I see. So they tracked their smoking habits and their health outcomes over time.
Exactly. And they were looking forward instead of backward, and the results were just striking.
I bet. What did they find?
They found that the heavy smokers had a lung cancer death rate that was 24 times higher than the non-smokers. And then just a few years later, the American Cancer Society did a similar study and got pretty much the same results. Both studies gave even stronger evidence that smoking and lung cancer were linked.
24 times higher.
Yeah.
It's a huge difference. It seems like the evidence was really starting to pile up at that point. But I'm guessing there were still some skeptics out there.
Oh, absolutely. Critics like Fisher were still arguing that there might be some other difference between smokers and non-smokers that nobody had measured yet.
Yeah, I can see that.
They were saying, maybe smokers are more likely to be risk takers, or maybe they have different diets, or even maybe they have different personalities, and that all these things could somehow be linked to both smoking and lung cancer. You see what they were getting at?
Right. It goes back to the idea of those confounding factors.
Exactly.
There could be some hidden variable that's influencing both smoking and lung cancer.
Precisely.
Making it seem like smoking is the cause when it's really something else entirely. So how did researchers address this confounding problem in the smoking debate?
This is where the work of Jerome Cornfield, a researcher at the National Institutes of Health, was really influential. He basically tackled Fisher's argument head-on.
Oh, wow. How did he do that?
Well, he used this really smart statistical approach. It later became known as Cornfield's inequality.
Okay, and what was the gist of it?
Imagine him saying, okay, let's say there is this smoking gene that explains everything. How strong would this gene have to be to account for the huge difference in lung cancer rates between smokers and non-smokers?
That's an interesting way to go about it. Instead of trying to prove the gene doesn't exist, he's basically saying, let's assume it does exist and see if it even makes sense mathematically.
Exactly. And when he did the math, he found that for the smoking gene to explain everything, it would have to be ridiculously common among smokers, almost like every smoker would have to have it.
Wow, so it was basically statistically impossible.
Pretty much. This was highly improbable, especially back then.
So Cornfield basically poked a big hole in the smoking gene theory.
You got it. His work was a powerful example of what we call sensitivity analysis.
And that is.
It basically means testing how sensitive our conclusions are to different assumptions.
I see.
In this case, it showed that even if we assume there's a confounding factor, it would have to be insanely strong to explain the actual data. But it wasn't just the epidemiological studies that were pointing to this link.
Right, because around the same time all this was going on.
Researchers were also doing lab studies. They were finding that when they painted rats with cigarette tar, the rats developed cancer.
Oh, wow. Really?
Yep. And they were actually identifying specific carcinogens, those cancer-causing substances, in cigarette smoke itself.
So the evidence was coming from multiple directions. Human studies, animal studies, and even the chemical analysis of cigarette smoke. That's pretty compelling.
It was.
But even with all this, I know the tobacco industry kept denying the link for decades.
Yeah, it's a sad truth. They ran a massive misinformation campaign highlighting any tiny bit of doubt they could find.
It's kind of disheartening to think about. It shows how powerful industries can really try to muddy the waters when it comes to science.
And what's even worse is that later on, internal documents from these tobacco companies revealed they actually knew about the dangers of smoking long before they ever admitted it publicly.
Oh, wow. That's just terrible. So how did things finally change?
Well, the big turning point was in 1964 when the U.S. Surgeon General released that landmark report on smoking and health.
Oh, yeah. I've heard of that.
It was a big deal. The report reviewed all the available evidence and said flat out that cigarette smoking was a definite cause of lung cancer in men.
That must have sent shockwaves through the industry.
It did. The report led to some major changes. Warnings on cigarette packs, bans on tobacco advertising.
Oh, wow.
And in the end, it contributed to a decrease in smoking rates. But here's the thing that's kind of interesting. The committee that put together the Surgeon General's report, they didn't actually have a formal language for talking about causality. They recognized that statistics alone couldn't prove causation.
Right.
So instead, they relied on a combination of things. How consistent the findings were across different studies, how strong the association was, whether the cause came before the effect, which makes sense, right? And if it all fit with other scientific knowledge.
Yeah, that sounds like a common sense way to approach it.
It was. And these ideas were later expanded upon by, remember Austin Bradford Hill, one of the researchers we talked about earlier?
Yeah.
Well, these criteria became known as Hill's criteria, and they're actually still used today as a guide for figuring out causality, especially when you can't do those randomized controlled trials.
So they're like a practical checklist for evaluating whether a connection is likely to be causal.
Exactly. But it's important to remember they're not a rigid set of rules, more like guidelines. Each criterion has its limitations and exceptions, and you got to consider them within the context of all the evidence you have.
That makes sense. It sounds like the whole story of smoking and lung cancer is a perfect example of how science works. Through careful observation, testing, and being willing to change your mind when the evidence points in a different direction.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It's really remarkable how, despite all the skepticism and even outright denial, the scientific community was able to figure out this link and make a real difference in public health. But, this chapter isn't just about smoking, right?
Oh, there's more. I'm intrigued. What else is there?
Well, the story of smoking and lung cancer kind of sets the stage for an even deeper dive into the crazy world of causality.
I'm ready.
And one of the most fascinating examples comes from a pretty unexpected area. Birth weights.
Birth weights. That's definitely not what I was expecting. How does that tie into all of this?
Well, this is where we run into something called the birth weight paradox. It's a classic example of how our gut feelings about cause and effect can be totally wrong, and how hidden biases in data can really mess with our conclusions.
Ooh, a paradox. This is getting interesting.
Hold on tight, because this is where things get really wild.
All right, lay it on me. What's this birth weight paradox all about?
Well, it all started with a study back in 1959. A researcher named Jacob Yerushalmi wanted to see if there was a link between smoking during pregnancy and a baby's chances of dying in the first month of life. And of course, they were also looking at birth weight, since we know smoking can lead to lower birth weights.
Right, so I'm guessing the assumption was that babies with lower birth weights, especially those born to mothers who smoked, would be more likely to die. Seems logical.
That's what you'd think, right? But that's not what they found at all.
Really? What happened?
They found that among the low birth weight babies, the ones born to mothers who smoked actually had a higher survival rate.
Wait, seriously? That seems completely backwards. How is that even possible?
It does seem strange, doesn't it? It's like smoking was somehow protecting those babies. But trust me, that's not what's going on here. It's something called collider bias.
Collider bias. Okay, now you've lost me. What's that?
Let me give you an example. Imagine you're at a dog show and you see this adorable golden retriever with a blue ribbon.
Okay, I love golden retrievers.
And you overhear someone saying, "Oh, that dog didn't win for its obedience skills."
Interesting. So what did it win for?
Exactly. You automatically start thinking, well, it must have won for something else, like its looks or maybe some special trick.
Right, you're kind of eliminating one possibility.
Exactly. You're assuming it won for a different reason, even though you didn't actually see the competition. That's collider bias in action.
Okay, so how does that apply to the birth weight paradox? I'm still not seeing the connection.
Think of low birth weight as the winning at the dog show. There are lots of different things that can lead to a baby being born with a low weight. Smoking is one, but there's also premature birth, genetic factors, health problems during pregnancy, all sorts of things.
So there are lots of different paths to the same outcome.
Precisely. But when we only look at the low birth weight babies, we're kind of ignoring all those other possibilities. It's like we're only looking at the dogs that won without considering all the different categories they could have won in.
Okay, so I'm starting to see it. But where does the smoking part come in?
Well, when we see a low birth weight baby and we know the mother smoked, it's almost like we're ruling out those other more serious causes like severe birth defects.
Because those babies might not have survived.
Exactly. So it makes it look like smoking is somehow protective, but it's really just an illusion created by our focus on that specific group of low birth weight babies.
Oh, that's pretty mind-blowing. So the birth weight paradox isn't really about birth weight at all. It's about how we can be tricked by our assumptions.
You got it. And this is a perfect example of why we need to be really careful about how we interpret data.
It's not enough to just see a correlation. We need to dig deeper to understand the causal relationship.
Exactly. And that's where those causal diagrams can be so valuable.
Right. They help us visualize those relationships and see the bigger picture.
It's like having a roadmap to navigate the complex world of cause and effect.
It's fascinating how just understanding this one concept, collider bias, can really change how we look at things.
Yeah, it's like once you see it, you start noticing it everywhere. Makes you realize you can't just take things at face value.
Exactly. It makes you wonder how much of what we think we know is actually based on these kinds of hidden biases.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sure it's more common than we realize. But hey, that's why we're exploring this stuff, right? To become more aware of those biases and think more critically about the world around us.
Absolutely. So is there anything else from this chapter that really stood out to you?
You know, one thing that really struck me was the point the book makes about the limits of relying only on statistics when we're trying to understand complex problems.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. They were basically saying that statistics can only tell us so much, right?
Exactly. Numbers and data are incredibly useful, don't get me wrong, but they don't always give us the full picture. Sometimes we need to go beyond the numbers and really dig into the underlying mechanisms, the why behind the what.
It's like statistics can show us that there's a connection between two things, but they can't always tell us what's actually driving that connection.
A perfect example is, well, the smoking debate we talked about earlier. The study showed a clear correlation between smoking and lung cancer, but it was the lab research that actually revealed how smoking causes cancer. Those carcinogens in cigarette smoke that directly damage our cells.
Right, so the stats gave us the big picture, but the lab work helped us understand the mechanics of how it all works.
Precisely. And this is where having a solid understanding of causality is so important. It's about connecting the dots and understanding those underlying processes, not just observing patterns in the data.
Like the difference between knowing your car is broken down and actually knowing what caused the breakdown.
Exactly. A flat tire, a dead battery, a busted engine. Understanding the cause is what allows you to fix the problem. And the same principle applies to so many things in life, from health and medicine to economics and social policy.
This is all starting to click for me now. It's like once you start thinking about causality, you see the world in a whole new way. You start questioning things more and demanding more evidence before you just accept something as true.
I think that's a great takeaway from this whole conversation. Understanding causality isn't just some abstract academic concept. It's a really powerful tool for making sense of the world around us and making better decisions. It's about thinking critically, challenging assumptions, and always looking for the underlying mechanisms that drive the patterns we see.
Well said. This whole conversation has been a fantastic journey through some really important ideas. I feel like I have a much better grasp on the power of causal thinking now.
Me too. It's always exciting to explore these ideas and see how they can be applied in so many different areas of life.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the world of causality. It's been a real pleasure.
It's been my pleasure too. Always a great time talking about this stuff.
And to all our listeners out there, keep those causal minds engaged. We'll see you next time on Decoding Causality.